Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. So I'm going to do a little watercoloring today, and I will be using the shell image on this Honeybee Stamps Anchors of Hope stamp set. And I'm going to use one of the sentiments here as well. I have also pulled into my stash this layering shells die set. I don't end up using that. I have the burlap embossing folder, also from Honeybee Stamps. And I have Honeybee Stamps layered rectangles. They make framed rectangles. I can't remember what it's called. Sorry. I have some glitter paper. I have some craft cardstock. And I have a piece of watercolor paper. I will be stamping in Versaclear Nocturne black ink, and then I will heat emboss it, and I'm going to be watercoloring with my Winsor Newton palette. I think that's all the coloring, so let's go ahead and jump on into our crime. Our alphabetical journey today takes us to the state of North Carolina. Now, King Charles II granted 8 proprietors a colony they named Carolina after the king, and that was established in about 1670 with the first permanent settlement at Charlestown, aka Charleston. But because of the difficulty of governing the entire colony of Charlestown, the colony was eventually divided, and North Carolina was established as a royal colony in 1729 and one of the 13 colonies. Now, the Halifax Resolves was a resolution that was adopted by North Carolina in April of 1776, and it was the first formal call for independence from Great Britain among the American colonies. On November 21st, 1789, North Carolina became the 12th state to ratify the United States Constitution. North Carolina is home to the highest peak east of the Mississippi, Mount Mitchell, with a high point of 6,684 feet. Didn't know that, given that they were on the coast. I assumed sea level was sea level. The largest private estate in the United States is located in Asheville, North Carolina. It's the Biltmore Estate, and it was built for the Vanderbilt family. North Carolina is home to 2 favorites, Pepsi and Krispy Kreme, and they are also the greatest producer of sweet potatoes. North Carolina is also the birthplace of miniature golf. North Carolina is home to beautiful beaches, wild horses, and lighthouses, and is quite possibly the first place in the United States that a woman was hung. And the reasons why she was hung are still questionable. We're going to meet Frances Stewart Silver. She was born in either 1814 or 1815. I couldn't find a day or a month or even a confirmation of the year, so about that time. Her parents were Isaiah and Barbie Stewart, and Frankie, as she was called, was the 4th of their children and the only girl. Now, the family moved to Burke County, North Carolina, when Frankie was young, around 1820, and they lived in the town of Kona. Charles Silver was born on the 3rd of October, 1812, in Buchan, North Carolina, and his parents are Jacob and Elizabeth Silver, and he was apparently their only child. Now, Charlie and Frankie met at some point in time, and in about 1830 they were married. I could not find a marriage date either. It is recorded, though, that Charlie made his living as a hunter and a trapper. And in time, they had one child, a daughter named Nancy Matilda Silver Parker, who was born on November 3rd, 1830. And the rest of the story depends on who you hear it from. So we're going to start with the story that Charlie's family has claimed to be the factual events. According to Charlie's parents and some extended family, on December 23rd, 1831, Frankie showed up at Charlie's parents' home with their daughter Nancy, and she had stated that she rose early to finish her household chores so that she could join them for a little pre-holiday family time. But then she expressed some concern. She told Charlie's parents that Charlie had come home from his work hunting the day before. He had spent some time chopping enough wood to last through the holiday, and then walked across the lake into town to get the Christmas liquor. But he still hadn't returned, and that was all the day before. So Charlie's family was supposedly skeptical of her account and arranged a search party. Although one account I did read said that she encouraged them to help her look for him. However, a search party was organized, and the search party didn't exactly find Charlie. What they found was a pool of blood that had leaked through the planks of the floor in Charlie and Frankie's house. They also found a fireplace full of oily ashes and blood spatter around the cabin. There were pieces of bone and flesh discovered in ashes that had been poured into a mortar hole near the spring, as well as a heel iron. And the heel iron is the part that goes into a moccasin-style shoe to keep the heel from wearing out the leather. And that was supposedly very similar to the style of shoe that Charlie wore on his hunting trips. What was missing, according to Charlie's family, was the multiple-day supply of firewood that Charlie was supposed to have chopped and split. Now, according to the Silver family, this was proof that Frankie had something to do with Charlie's disappearance and that her hardworking husband had been disposed of in the fireplace. They claimed that Frankie was furious with Charlie for his repeated infidelities, and apparently the family had a loud enough voice in the community that this became the thought. This was the truth. They said it, people listened, and this became the truth. So Frankie is now the most probable suspect in the death of Charlie. Even though they don't have all of him, they have enough of him to assume he is dead. And her mother, Barbara, and her brother, Jackson, who went by Blackstone, were also assumed to be involved. So Frankie and her mother and her brother were all arrested. Now, Barbara and Blackstone pled not guilty before a magistrate on January 17th of 1832, and they were discharged. And that left Frankie alone to stand trial for the murder of her husband, Charlie Silver. Regardless of the story Charlie's family was telling about the town, there wasn't any proof that Frankie had murdered him. There was no physical proof tying Frankie to the items, the evidence found in their cabin. Frankie did not make any confessions, although the local papers alluded to the fact that Frankie had indeed confessed. There was also another theory floating around. Frankie's parents and some of her other family members were planning to move west. And one newspaper speculated that Frankie wanted to go with them, but that Charlie would not agree to go. So, innuendo, supposition, gossip, all the things that normally surround any type of murder spree, right? Or I shouldn't say a spree, any type of homicide event. Well, nobody else was investigated that I could tell, and so Frankie stood trial. Now, her trial began on the 29th of March of 1832, and all the evidence that was used against Frankie would now be considered so circumstantial that it was not evidence. But that's the evidence that was presented at the trial. The blood pool, the oily ashes, the discarded tissue, the missing wood pile. Frankie did not testify in her defense. In fact, she was not even legally allowed to testify in her defense because at this time in North Carolina, women could not testify as witnesses in court. So even if she had wanted to get on the stand and say, I did not do this, she was not allowed. The trial lasted 2 days, and at the end of those 2 days, the jury returned an undecided verdict. They couldn't decide. I'm guessing that's what we would call a hung jury today. But that wasn't good enough for the sitting judge and the people of the community. After some further instructions, which does occasionally still happen now, and the jury was sent back to participate in further deliberations, And after doing so, the jury found Frankie guilty. She was guilty. She was sentenced to hang for the murder of her husband, Charlie Silver. Now, Frankie's attorneys, however, had another theory of events that unfolded the night that ended in Charlie's death. They believed and they said that Charlie was an abusive husband, and that for some reason, on the 22nd of December, he went too far and Frankie reacted. A man named B.S. Gaither, he was the clerk of court, and he actually remarked to the newspaper that there was strong evidence about Charlie's abuse and, quote, that if his wife had admitted the killing and pleaded self-defense, end quote, then more than likely she would have been acquitted of his death. So Frankie's attorneys were unsuccessful in convincing the judge that she was not a murderer. They did not present the defense that she was an abused spouse, but they disagreed with the classification of her as a murderer. Now, the attorneys appealed her conviction, and a lot of women in the county actually appealed to the governor, and they wanted him to set aside Frankie's conviction. So the legal appeals went to the court, and the women in the community went to the governor, and all of the voices of appeal went unheard, and the conviction stood. Frankie's family, however, was not willing to let this be the end of her story. So this is the kind of family you need to have. Okay, I shouldn't say that out loud because I don't think you should break out of jail. But during the time between her sentencing and her scheduled hanging, Frankie was broken out of jail by someone who entered into the jailhouse through a basement window. And they had a set of false keys. So I'm guessing that's like a master key, not an official key. I couldn't find what that meant. But this person opened the doors leading to the prisoner's cell. And this is how the story goes. This is how it was reported in a local paper. Quote, her family broke her out of jail, cut her hair short, and dressed her in men's clothing. A sheriff's posse found them trying to make their getaway in a hay wagon. Frankie was in the hay until she was out of sight. Then she walked beside the wagon. Someone in the posse yelled to her, Frankie. She called back to him in a deep voice, I thank you, sir, but my name is Tommy. Her uncle then added, yeah, her name is Tommy. Him saying her gave them away, so back to jail she went, end quote. So Frankie was, in fact, recaptured by the sheriff's posse and returned to the prison in Morgantown, North Carolina, where she was hung on Friday, the 12th of July, 1833. Frankie's father's intention was to bring his daughter's body home and bury it in the family plot. However, that particular day was extremely hot, and the humidity was, humidity in North Carolina, but it was above average. And that meant that her father had to bury her in an unmarked grave around the Buckhorn Tavern, which was then a few miles west of Morganton. For many years, the exact location of the grave was unknown. It is now believed that the proper location of the grave, or probable location of the grave, is on the DeVault farm. And in 1952, a granite stone marking the probable location of the grave was placed by Beatrice Cobb, who was the editor of a local paper. However, she misspelled Frankie's last name. She named it Silvers instead of Silver. And if you think that is the sad end to this story, well, buckle up, because I have something else for you to chew on. A man named Nicholas Woodfin, who is allegedly or supposedly Frankie's defense counsel, and later became a very prominent attorney in Asheville, argued that Frankie did not willfully kill Charles. His statement was that he believed Charles came home drunk and began beating her with a stick, and that Frankie just had enough and struck him back and killed him in self-defense. How he did not attempt to, in the information I found, justify the disposal of the remains. He did say that this is the story he got from Frankie herself, and that it is in his notes from when he represented her. He called Frankie's death a miscarriage of justice and stated that she was hung unjustly. He claimed, this man, Nicholas, claimed that Frankie lived in a rather isolated area, and she had no social connections. Her only support was her husband's family, who lived the closest, and then her own family, who lived slightly farther away. And given that it was still a common, although very backward and not okay practice, to beat your wife to keep them in line, Frankie had no idea who she could turn to outside her family for help. And we've already witnessed that her family tried to help her, right? Her mom and her brother were willing to be arrested with her. They tried to help her escape. And the funny thing is that even Charlie's family did not admit that he was, or did not argue that he was abusive toward Frankie. They're the ones who put out the idea that she was jealous because he was unfaithful. So clearly Charlie was not the best kind of husband material if he is unfaithful to his wife and beating her. Oh, my goodness. It was also suggested in a later, and I have that source linked below, in a later paper, that there may have been some impropriety in the judge's instructions for the jury to try again. I have seen that happen in modern cases where the jury comes back deadlocked and the judge says, "Are you sure? Would another day of deliberation change your mind?" But what I've not seen in modern law cases is for the judge to re-instruct the jury. Basically, "Are you sure? Because I really think she's guilty," kind of thing, right? So there is some suggestion that the way that the judge instructed the jury to go back until they could agree she was guilty may have been illegal. And having a trial where the defendant isn't allowed to testify in their own behalf. Not that you should have to, right? That's in the whole Constitution, self-incrimination thing, right? But it wasn't that she didn't want to. She was literally not allowed. So we don't know if she wanted to testify on her own behalf or not. She was literally not allowed. Another weird thing, there are no legal transcripts from her trial that have been found yet. However, when Nicholas, the man who claims to have been her attorney, said that his notes were where he referenced his notes in telling Frankie's confession and telling the story about Frankie's abuse, Charlie's family said there weren't any notes to be found, that it couldn't be true because there were no notes to be found. This was decades before battered women's laws were enacted, and all we have left is a two-sided story with no written record, no record of Frankie's supposed confessions, no record of Frankie's conversations with her attorneys, no record of how the evidence was obtained and who obtained it, and how they know that the things that they found belong to Charlie. We don't have a written record of how the judge instructed the jury. So were his instructions lawful, or were they him trying to get this piece of dirty business taken care of and off of his docket? Unfortunately, we just don't know that. And we don't know if the statements that Nicholas is attributing to Frankie as being a confession of sorts through their, attorney-client work meetings, if she really said those things. We also don't know that. Her parents never made, that I could find, a public statement about her life with Charlie. I could not find anything where her family said, this is a load of BS. Charlie beat her often and she just couldn't take it anymore. They didn't say anything. They didn't, that I could find. I'm sure that they did, but there's no record of them saying, hey, this is not how this worked out. So we just don't know. And here we are back to one of these cases that has my brain going in weird places. Like, it was so common for men to beat their wives that nobody would have questioned that. The problem was, a lot of people wouldn't have thought it was a problem. So even if Frankie had said, yeah, I was tired of getting beat up every day and I just lost my mind, she may still have been held accountable. Now, the clerk of the court was, in his own opinion, convinced she would have gotten a much lighter sentence, if not acquitted at all. If not acquitted entirely, if she had admitted that it was self-defense or the defense of their child even. But who knows? It was still just so common for people to use that out in their relationships. That's a really bad phrase, to behave that way in their relationships and have it be called normal. There is records of Nancy, and she grew up to be a pretty young lady. I did not look to see which side of the family raised her. I probably should have. Hold on, let me go back and see if I can find that. Okay, so here's what I found about Nancy. So Nancy, it says after her mother was hung, she was raised by her grandmother, but it doesn't say which grandmother. And she was married at the age of 19 to David Parker. Their marriage was happy and successful, but 11 years into their marriage, the Civil War started, and her husband was enlisted in the Confederate Army. He was wounded in action and then died from his wounds in 1865. Nancy remarried because she was a widow with children, and she married a man whose last name was his name was William Robinson. They also had a son, but their marriage failed. And after their separation, she started using her first husband's surname again. And she actually lived to be 71 years old with children from both marriages. So her remains were actually buried with her first husband's remains, and he's buried in a mass grave for Confederate casualties in Richmond, Virginia. So not too terribly far away from where I live. So Nancy grew up to have a better life than her mother did, clearly. It doesn't say which grandmother raised her, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that probably it was her mom's mom. I don't know why I think that. I just do. I don't know. I feel like probably she would have had a happier life with her mom's family than with her dad's family, especially if her grandfather was abusive like his son was. That's just my opinion. So I don't know, y'all. I found this story, and at first I wasn't going to tell the story because there's just so little information on it. But then I decided, you know what, this is a story we should tell because we need to understand that, like Maya Angelou says, you do the best you can with what you know, and when you know better, you do better. And now we need to do better. We know better, and now we need to do better. So that's kind of why I picked the story. Plus, I'm intrigued by Frankie. So I did find a sketch of Frankie. And I'm not, to be honest, I only think this is her. This is the only image that comes up when I Google search her name that is not her husband or her father-in-law. I also found a picture of her headstone here. And you can see here that they added an S to her last name. I also found a picture of Nancy. This must have been taken about the time she got married. She looks kind of young here. So thanks for hanging out with me today. I hope you were intrigued by this story and enjoyed the coloring. I have a couple of other videos here I think you will like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed, I would love it if you did. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video. Leave a comment down below and tell me how you feel about the story. And have a really fabulous day.